Greetings friends, my name is Pavel Stelmach and now we will dive into the top news of this day. Behind the front lines of the war, Russian forces are trying to ensure that the territory they have captured can never be integrated into Ukraine again, informed Bloomberg according to European intelligence officials. In more than a year since the invasion, Moscow has entrenched its control of large parts of southern and eastern Ukraine by engineering cultural and demographic shifts through violence, economic coercion, and replacement of local populations, the officials said, asking not to be named, discussing confidential material. The goal of those alleged war crimes appears to be to eliminate the Ukrainian identity in the areas Russia has occupied, the European officials said. As a result of those abuses, Kyiv will need more than just success on a battlefield to re-establish control.
Let's call it what it is. Russia's forcible deportation of innocent Ukrainian children is a systematic attempt to erase Ukraine's future. James Cleverly, Foreign Secretary of the United Kingdom, on Twitter.
The Russian strategy involves the systematic repression, torture and murder of Ukrainian officials and the deportation of thousands of Ukrainian children to Russia. The Russians have also conscripted Ukrainian men and forced them to fight their own people. The effort to manufacture a culturally Russian population loyal to the Kremlin borrows tactics that were previously deployed in the eastern part of Ukraine, Donbass, and the Crimean Peninsula after they were captured in 2014. Russian actions in the regions of Donetsk, Kherson, Luhansk and Zaporizhia have been well documented, culminating in the International Criminal Court issuing arrest warrants against Putin and Russia's Commissioner for Children's Rights, Maria Lvova-Belova, accusing them of illegally deporting hundreds of children from Ukraine. Russia has kidnapped almost 20,000 minors since it launched its full-scale invasion. However, European officials are starting to articulate fears about how difficult it may be for Ukraine to govern the occupied regions if it can reclaim them, after months of Russian abuses designed to engineer support for the Kremlin. The focus on indoctrinating Ukrainian children with Russian propaganda demonstrates the Kremlin's long-term plans for the territories, the officials said. In Kherson region, Russia has established at least 20 detention and torture sites where Ukrainian local government officials and protesters were sent, the European officials once again confirmed. These torture sites have direct financial links to the Kremlin, according to a team of international lawyers investigating alleged Russian war crimes in Ukraine. Ukrainians involved in administrative roles or civic society have been murdered, arrested or deported. Last year, the OSCE documented direct targeting of civilians by Russian forces, attacks on medical facilities, rape, torture, summary executions, looting, and forced deportation of civilians to Russia, including children. Moscow has also offered financial endorsements to Russians to move to the regions, replacing deported Ukrainians. Those Ukrainians still living in the territories are being pressured to accept Russian passports, with residents in the occupied parts of Kherson region warned that anyone who doesn't accept one by June will be deported and have their property seized.
The Russian occupiers continue the forced passporting of the population of the temporary occupied territory of the Kherson region. In order to speed up this process, the invaders are conducting demonstrative raids aimed at intimidating the local population with possible deportation and alienation of property. The content of the events is that a convoy of empty buses arrives at the settlement accompanied by a representative of the FSB, who, referring to the decree recently signed by the President of the Russian Federation on the deportation of persons without Russian citizenship from the occupied territories, set people a radical condition. Either they give up their Ukrainian passport in favor of Russian or immediate eviction with confiscation of property.
Declining to accept a Russian passport can see Ukrainians in the occupied territories denied access to basic public services. But of those who do accept, some are being forcibly enlisted in the Russian army. Yale University Humanitarian Research Lab reported in February that Russia is operating a large-scale, systematic network of camps that has held at least 6,000 children from Ukraine within Russia-occupied Crimea and across mainland Russia during the past year. The camps appear to be trying to indoctrinate Ukrainian children into the Russian government's idea of national culture and history, the authors said. Over the past months, the number of advertisements for contract military service has increased several times in Russia. Officials are filming videos about it. People are once again being imposed the concept of a real man. In Russian cities, on May 9th, recruitment points for the army were working, and calls to become a contract soldier began to be placed on utility bills. At the same time, according to the Russian propaganda agency RIA Novosti, Putin announced the start of military training of Russians in reserve. Andrei Katapolov, leader of the State Duma Committee on Defense, immediately announced that summons for military training would be sent by net, and human rights activists recalled that the training could result in obtaining a military specialty, an officer rank, and this would make a person more vulnerable to the threat of partial mobilization. Until a new wave of mobilization in Russia is announced, the Ministry of Defense is actively recruiting labor migrants who come to migration centers for labor patents. The Russians are reassured that these are supposedly planned measures to improve the combat training of reservists, which are held annually. Indeed, they were held last year, but now the atmosphere for holding them in Russia is very different. After all, Moscow needs to replenish the occupation contingent. Heading mobilization does not provide a result. The regions are failing. The plan for recruiting soldiers for the contract is not being fulfilled either. And if the Kremlin does not begin to correct this, huge problem with personnel will begin in Russia already this fall. Therefore, Putin is left with two options: a new public wave of mobilization, which is unpopular in Russia, or a combination of different surrogates. Fees is one of them. It is not necessary that reservists be sent to the front, but the facts prove they can. Even as they can, they will clarify the data, entertain them in the training grounds, and then, bam, at the front line. Against the backdrop of the decision to assemble, the question arose with renewed vigor: where did this professional army and partially mobilized ones go? What are the real losses of Russian troops?
Russian forces are facing significant shortfalls in munitions and are under significant personal constraints, but continue to lay minefields and prepare new defensive positions in occupied Ukrainian territory. In fact, if Russia does not initiate a mandatory mobilization and secure substantial third-party ammunition supplies beyond existing deliveries from Iran and others, it will be increasingly challenging them for sustain even modest offensive operations. Avril Haines, Director of National Intelligence of United States.
As CNN wrote in April, the Kremlin has problems with the formation of a prepared military force, but fears the launch of a new wave of mobilization due to the mood of the population. The army needs another 400,000 soldiers, and this is not only for the war against Ukraine, but also for new formations that will be stationed on the new border with NATO, near Finland. Whether the population will be able to withstand another round of mobilization is currently unclear. However, the fact that the Kremlin does not do this indicates that they have certain concerns about this. If Prigozhin continues to criticize the Ministry of Defense of Russia and talk about failures at the front, then in publications he should be positioned as a traitor to Russia. Russian propagandists have already received a warning from the presidential administration, Medusa reports, citing a source in one of the Russian state media. Let me remind you that earlier the Washington Post newspaper claimed that the Russian Ministry of Defense was preparing a public campaign criticizing Prigozhin, but could not organize it. Now the development of a similar campaign is already underway in the presidential administration, in case Prigozhin continues to break away. Public attacks against the military department by the head of the PMC Wagner have become regular since the beginning of May 2023. He demanded that the Ministry of Defense provided him with more munitions to continue the fighting in Bakhmut, otherwise threatening to withdraw his mercenaries from their positions in 5 days. The very next day, the creator of the PMC said that the Russian Defense Ministry had promised him ammunition, and the Wagner remained in Bakhmut. However, later, Yevgeny Prigozhin published a 27-minute video in which he said that his units received only 10% of the required shells, and again began to blackmail the leadership of the Ministry of Defense. In addition, he said that one of the regular units of the Russian army had already fled from Bakhmut. At the same time, Prigozhin reasoning about the happy grandfather caused a special resonance. Of course, he can say that this is about Shoigu or about an abstract layman, but people draw clear conclusions. The Ukrainian law enforcement agencies also responded to all these statements.
None of this trio wants to take responsibility. That's why they started looking for extremes. Now Shoigu, Gerasimov and Prigozhin are deciding among themselves who will be guilty. Andriy Yusov, representative of the main intelligence directorate of the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine.
I would like to point out that there is a lot of panic in the Russian army and among the Russian mass media. They react very actively to everything. Yesterday evening, Russian correspondents started saying in front of each other that the Ukrainian counteroffensive had begun. Later, the Ministry of Defense of Russia itself had to refute this. But it is hard to believe them because they have already destroyed hundreds of HIMARS, Ukrainian planes and anti-aircraft, as recently as February 24th of last year. Only strikes against Russian ammunition continue to be carried out. Ukrainian planes continue to perform their tasks, and Ukrainian air defense continues to work. Thanks to our Western partners too. That concludes our today's video. Thank you for staying with us and keep tuned for future videos. Subscribe to our channel and goodbye.